All right. So we finished up lesson 2. For all intents and purposes, we looked at some of the aspects of the plan of the design of the church and how God has established it. And we basically finished up the questions from last week as well. The last one discussed how efforts to change the divine plan for the church reflect a lack of faith in God. And as we discussed, the insufficiency, if people try to change it, in essence, they're claiming that God designed an insufficient church, an insufficient plan. And by trying to change that, it shows that lack of trust and belief that God has made those accommodations, no matter what changes in terms of technology or society, that it's always going to be ever present, ever applicable to man and the soul of man. Nolan? Did I see a hand? Oh, okay. Timeless, yeah. It's timeless. Yeah, and as we ended last week, we noticed how that, or noted how that the scriptures and in terms of the church and the worship, the work of the church, it can be done anywhere. You don't have to have a building. You can meet, if there's an understood location, like in some places where they have under the big tree, okay, it's where the shade is. It's where they meet to gather together on the Lord's Day. Wherever an identified location may be that brethren are able to gather together to worship, they can sing, they can take the Lord's Supper. You don't have to have a building, you don't have to have electricity, you don't have to have all of those things in order to be able to fulfill the commandments that God has given us. Technically, we don't even need psalm books. I mean, there are some hymns that I think probably most of us know by heart that we could sing if we had to. Okay, psalm books are simply an expedient, and we talked a little bit about that last week as well. They're just an expedient to assist us in making sure we're all on the same page, make sure all things are being done decently and in order, we're all singing the same line and so forth. But certainly God's word can be fulfilled even without the benefit of technology or creature comforts or anything else. All right, was there anything else through lesson 2 that anybody wanted to mention before we move on to lesson 3? All right, lesson 3 is how scriptural authority can be established. This is the longest chapter so far of the 3 lessons that we have been looking at. And as we have been doing, we're going to just very quickly look at the kind of an overview of the lesson. We're going to cover our questions, but then there's some specifics that I definitely want to spend some time on the latter half of this lesson. I want to spend a little bit of time on some of those things that Brother Cogdell brings up. The introduction: authority is the right to command or direct and enforce obedience or administer punishment. To authorize a thing is to empower to act, to direct by authority. In divine affairs, all authority inheres in God. Inhere means it exists in God. It permanently rests in God. And as a result of that, recognizing that God, being the one who has created all things and designed all things, he then gave all authority to his Son, as Jesus says that all authority had been given to him in heaven and on earth. God has given to Christ absolute authority in the church. And there's some aspects of that we'll talk about as well when we go back through if we have time. But one of the points that he makes, I think, is a good point. The church is an absolute monarchy. Jesus has all authority. Nothing can be done without his authorization, and nothing can be added to his word or taken away from it without his say-so. And of course, he said it in effect where there is no need to add to or take away. And so that's part of kind of an interesting point that he makes, being an absolute monarchy. Christ gave binding and loosing authority only to his apostles, in so much as the apostles carried with them the teaching of the gospel. Now, we noted last week, it was very important to point out, one of the points that Brother Cogdell made was that the apostles almost served as the Supreme Court in the purpose of directing the saints regarding God's word. It's not the Supreme Court's job to make rules or dictate policy or law. It's the Supreme Court's job to interpret that law and therefore apply it and make sure people understand what the law says. And I think it's important to remember that even though he doesn't bring Matthew 16 up here in this particular discussion until letter B, until point B that he brings up, but the idea of loosening and binding wasn't the sense that they could make their own decisions or their own judgments for what the church was going to be or not be, how the church was going to worship or not worship. It's not that the apostles had authority to determine what God's law was going to be or how the church was to be established. Jesus already had that established. But in terms of the loosening and binding, as referenced in Matthew chapter 16, the importance of acknowledging the authority of Christ then handed to the apostles, and certainly there are occasions like Acts 15 where it's not that they decided that circumcision isn't necessary for salvation. Christ had already bound that. And so it's the recognition of that binding and loosing on earth is reflected of what God has bound and loosed in heaven. Okay, whatever they are binding and loosing, it's through the guidance of the Holy Spirit in what God wants things, or what Christ wants things to be. It's not that they got to choose what was going to be and what wasn't. Third point of lesson 3, the authority of Christ exercised by the apostles completely in New Testament scriptures. Certainly we go through and we see how that everything the apostles did, especially after the church was established, it all went back to Jesus. There's consistent and constant reference to Jesus being the head of the church, the fact that in him all things dwell. And so it's important to acknowledge the authority of Christ, that the apostles didn't exercise their own authority in any way. It was always the authority of Jesus. And then, as I mentioned, this kind of the second half of lesson 3 talks about how to establish authority from New Testament scriptures. There's quite a bit on that. He goes and talks about generic and specific authority, and there's some really good examples that he brings up there as well. And then in conclusion, and we're not going to read that all of this, but he mentions in order for a thing to be authorized, there must be either precept, approved example, or necessary inference in the New Testament scriptures. And of course, part of the lesson kind of dives into the difference between those. And then he talks about two extremes, which is interesting as well. But in such cases, at the end of this first paragraph of the conclusion, in such cases, God has left man no choice but to respect God's stipulations by obeying his word or rebelling against divine authority by substituting or adding his own will. And ultimately, when you talk about the authority of God, that kind of sums it up. You either do what I tell you to do, or you go off and do your own thing. And that puts you in a position where you are rebelling against what I've said or what I've authorized. All right. Any thoughts? And again, we're going to go back and cover some specifics from the lesson itself, but any thoughts through that so far? All right, question 1 on our questions. There's 3 questions in this lesson. Explain how Christ entrusted his authority to the apostles and what that means for us today. After Jesus was raised in Matthew 28, he told the apostles that all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Well, how was it that Jesus entrusted that authority then to the apostles? Okay, he says, go into all the world. Okay, you make disciples of all the nations. And what was the means by which the making disciples took place? Teaching, preaching, and baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I've commanded you. Okay, it is very broad in the sense of what Jesus instructed the apostles to do. And certainly there are even more specific instances going forward. Jesus mentioned in John 16 how that he was going to send the Comforter, who would guide the apostles into all truth after Jesus obviously had died and was raised. And of course, that happens in Acts chapter 2. And so the Holy Spirit guiding them into all truth, coupled with, for all intents and purposes, what we call the Great Commission, the mission from Jesus to the apostles, which was to go into all the world and teach the gospel. And in doing so, certainly there were specifics involved in that, which we see going forward in the establishment of the church. But Christ, he directly, first of all, gave authority to the apostles. He also, I guess you could say, there's a sense of innate authority by sending the Holy Spirit. That's Jesus. He says, I will send the Comforter. And that direct connection of the Holy Spirit caring about the will of the Father, understanding Jesus was directing everything to go as it was supposed to. And so certainly, that being the case, what does that mean for us today? What does the authority of the apostles, how does that apply to us today?
Some try to discount the teaching of the apostles and only adhere to what Jesus said. But Ephesians 2 says the church is built on the foundation of the prophets and the apostles, with Jesus being the chief cornerstone.
Right.
So we can't discount what they said. It's from God.
Okay. So we can't discount not only what Jesus said, but also what the apostles said, recognizing that they were sent into the world to teach the gospel. But then also add to that, and certainly the lesson doesn't delve into this aspect of it, but the fact that there are a lot of religious organizations, denominations today that believe in what's called continuing or continual revelation, or the sense in which God's word can be changed and updated. And a lot of these religions borrow the concept of apostolic authority from that. And the idea is that the authority that Jesus gave to the apostles in the first century was then passed on by the apostles to their replacements. Okay, as apostles died or as apostles retired or got old enough where they couldn't maybe do as much, they passed that authority on to the next generation. And on and on and on it went. So that by, of course, you see in the 400s, you see the Catholic Church being formed, and a lot of the decisions of the Council of Nicaea and so forth being made regarding what we're going to teach, what we're going to stand for, and so forth. That same authority, that sense of continuing authority, then lends itself to changing God's word. And of course, that goes back to the root of the apostles' authority. Did they have the authority to change the word of God? No. That was never a part of their authority. Galatians 1, Paul says, if we, and by we, certainly any teacher of the gospel, but specifically those with authority, being the apostles, if we or an angel from heaven teach anything else than what you've already received, let him be accursed. Paul limited and acknowledged that limit of his own authority and the authority of the apostles by saying, this isn't something we can change. It doesn't need to be changed, but we can't change that. Okay, not even the apostles could change it. And so it's important to recognize that the fact that Christ entrusted his authority, it's true, but there were limitations. Christ, he made the rules, didn't he? He did not entrust that same authority to the apostles. Rather, he entrusted his authority to then relay what his rules are, how the church was to be established, how it was to function, how it was to worship, and so forth. He gave that authority to the apostles and then to direct the saints in more specific issues, like Acts 15 with the teaching of circumcision. And so all of that was entrusted to his apostles to then share that with the brethren. And we see that in the New Testament. But there were limitations even to the apostles' authority. That's important for us to point out today because there are entire denominations built on the thought process that the apostles had the authority to change God's word or to make changes, to make edits or whatever, and they never did. And they acknowledged that. Any other thoughts through question 1?
I think what Paul was saying in Galatians,
Right.
I'm speaking what was revealed to me.
Yeah. Yeah, he even mentions the gospel that was given to him.
If I authored this, then I could change this.
Sure.
I quote this, but I'm not the author of it, so I can't change it to one that told you.
Right.
In the first place, what I said.
Well, and that's like,
I've heard Joe give an explanation. The second time he says it in the second verse, he expands it to if anyone
yeah.
changes it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in Hebrews chapter 12 tells us who's the author and finisher? Jesus is. So no one can take the authority to in any way edit what Jesus has authored and finished. He didn't author it and leave it open-ended for people to add to it. He authored it and finished our faith. That includes the concept of the gospel and everything that it teaches regarding the church and worship and everything else.
Well, I was thinking about how something you mentioned, people were looking at what Jesus said, because I've had that conversation. Well, Jesus, his red words here are what we listen to, but when he entrusted that authority to the other apostles, that means, and when they say, be imitators of me, as I am, I can take comfort in that, and I know I'm safe to say, okay, well, Paul, this is the example Paul gave, this is what Paul said through the Holy Spirit.
Right.
It's just as binding.
Well, and it's important to remember as well that Jesus, the things that he taught, not that they weren't binding, they were, but the things that he taught also acknowledged the current law that they were living under. What law was Jesus living under? The law of Moses, okay, the Mosaical law. And so the things that Jesus had them do, for instance, when the lepers, when they were healed, what did Jesus tell them to go do? You remember? Yeah, to show yourself to the priest and offer the offering that you're commanded to under the law. Okay, now that's not binding for us in the sense that, well, if I'm healed of some disease or something, that I need to go and offer some offering in a temple. That's not what Jesus is establishing. He's simply reiterating the fact that you have to follow what Moses told you in the law, because that's the law they were under. But the fact that Jesus made accommodation, he acknowledged the differentiation between before he died and then after he died, and especially as of Acts chapter 2, after he's ascended, there is that understanding of that stamp of approval from Jesus by the very fact that the Holy Spirit was sent to the apostles in the first place. That gave them, that was that recognition of authority from Jesus, that now is when this begins. And as of Acts chapter 2, that's when the church started. And so, yeah, the red letters in our Bibles, are those words important? Absolutely, they're important. I mean, many times Jesus would reference the old law, but then what would he say? What phrase would he use? But I say unto you. Okay, in every one of those cases, he never contradicted the law of Moses. What he did was he went further to speak to the attitude and heart of the individual, not just the physical aspects of the law. He spoke to the heart and attitude behind what those physical aspects may have been in the law. And Jesus was, in all of those cases, he was even more specific than the law was. And so it certainly, yeah, I mean, do we follow what Jesus says? Sure. But that in no way takes away from the authority of the apostles that Jesus gave them in teaching the gospel. Anything else to question 1? Question 2, how may scriptural authority be established? There are 3 ways that Brother Cogdell goes over, and he gives example of all of them. There's direct command. Okay, within the direct command stratus, you've got both broad or general commands, and then you have specific command. But direct command, God says, this is what I want you to do. Okay, Jesus, when he told the apostles to go into all the world, did he specify how he wanted them to go into all the world? No. So could they take a boat? Could they walk? Could they ride a horse? Can they do live stream? Okay, sure. All of that and any of that would be part of teaching the gospel. But the general command was to do what? To teach the gospel. Okay? To make disciples of all the nations. That was the command. So you've got general and specific direct commands of God. What's the second one? Approved example. Yeah. And by approved example would Galatians, the letter to the Galatians, in which the saints were following kind of a hybrid version of the gospel of Christ with the law of Moses, would that be an example of approved example? What did Paul say? What did he tell them in verse 6 of Galatians 1? I marvel that what? You're so soon turned away. Okay, that's not an example of an approved example. That's an example of disapproved example. All right? Paul did not approve of the Galatians of what they were doing. In fact, in Galatians 5 and in verse 7, he says, you ran well, past tense. Who's hindered you from obeying the truth? Okay, so you have examples where correction needed to be made because saints weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. That doesn't give us the authority to do the same things those saints were doing because those were disapproved examples. They were condemned and corrected. However, we also have much, in terms of much more specific aspects of the church and what they did and so forth, was approved example. Okay, what the saints were doing. Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 20 and in verse 7 about the Lord's Day, for instance. They met on the first day of the week to take of the Lord's Supper, to break bread. We have a proved example of Paul referring to singing and making melody in our hearts to the Lord. So these are the aspects of a proved example that we want to follow. Those examples where the apostles are encouraging or are even implicitly acknowledging that what you're doing is right and good, not going beyond that. And that's very important to remember. We can't go beyond that. What's the third one? Necessary inference. And that's a very important point. It's not just inference. It's necessary inference. And in fact, one of the examples that Brother Cogdell brings up was in the Ten Commandments. What day were the Jews to observe? The Sabbath day. Does the Ten Commandments anywhere say every Sabbath day? It doesn't. It doesn't say every Sabbath. God simply says to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Okay, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. It doesn't say every Sabbath day. The necessary inference there is that, does God mean everyone? Yeah, he does. Well, fast forward to the New Testament. In the Lord's Day, we have a proved example all over the place of the New Testament saints meeting on the Lord's Day, on Sunday, the first day of the week. We have no example of them gathering together to partake of the Lord's Supper on any other day. Therefore, the necessary inference of that is what? Every Sunday, the saints gathered to do what? To take the Lord's Supper. And of course, worshiping God would have been a part of that. But particularly take the Lord's Supper. And of course, 1 Corinthians 16 includes the giving of our means, our contribution to the Lord's work.
It's kind of along those lines that the denominational world, a lot of them understand laying by in the store.
Every Sunday. Sometimes even 4 or 5 times, yeah.
But then when it comes to the Lord's Supper, well, in some cases, once a year.
Yeah.
Or once a month.
Or twice a year on the high holidays.
The big holiday.
Yeah. Yeah.
Christmas. So funny how they don't put,
They don't equate the two together, do they?
well, they're not together, but they don't use the same logic.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else to question 2? Yes, sir.
Kind of similar examples about Passover, but then we see later on, we don't really see that with the Sabbath as much as they failed to observe the Passover later on, like they were supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
And when the law is found, for instance, under Josiah, is one of the times they go back to observing the Passover. The admission of sin, therefore, having not done that which was commanded to be done.
Right. Yeah, that acknowledgement that we weren't doing this every year like we were supposed to, and that has to be acknowledged to God because we haven't been doing what we were supposed to be doing. And that's a great point, that understanding that this is to be done at this time, on this day of the year, every year. Yeah. And then, of course, the importance of the limitations of scriptural authority, recognizing that we can only, there's a phrase, it's not from the Bible, however, the Spirit is there from the Bible to speak where the Bible speaks and be silent where the Bible is silent. Okay, there are things that God says, and there are things that God doesn't say. Well, Nadab and Abihu made the mistake of delving into doing something of which they had not been commanded, and God punished them for it. It doesn't say they broke the command of the Lord. It says they did that which God had not commanded. God was silent on whatever it was that they did in addition to the offering of this fire of incense to the Lord. Whatever they did in that process, they added something to it that God didn't say anything about. And God punished them for it. There are limitations. We can't just say, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this because God said so, but then we're also going to add this, this, and this. We don't get to make those decisions. If we cannot establish authority for something, is it truly scriptural? Is the second part of question 2. If we cannot establish authority for something, is it truly scriptural, of the Scriptures, or of the authority of the Scriptures? No, it's not. Now, that's not to say, okay, talking about expedience and things like that, the Scriptures say nothing about psalm books, okay? The Scriptures say nothing about pews. But those are expedients that change nothing in terms of our worship to God. It does nothing in terms of changing the structure of the church. These things are simply conveniences to help us fulfill the commandments of the Lord. All right, there's a difference between something we're talking about establishing authority and that which is scriptural in terms of the function and the worship and the organization of the church versus something that is, for instance, the Lord's Supper table. We don't have to have a Lord's Supper table, but it's convenient to have it there so that we know where it's at all the time. Okay? There's nothing holy about the table. We don't have to have a baptistry, do we? No. Okay, those are all expedients, though, to assist us in the serving of God. Thoughts or comments through that? Okay. Question 3. What is the difference between generic and specific authority? Generic or general. It's also referenced as sometimes as general authority. Okay. So you've got details in the specifics. For instance, what type of wood was Noah supposed to make the ark out of? Gopher. Couldn't he have used oak? Pine? Okay, not and be in compliance with what God said. God was specific there. However, when God said to make this ark out of gopher wood, and of course he included the idea of pitch inside and out, did God specify what tools Noah had to use? Could Noah use a hammer and nails? Could he use a saw? Sure. Okay, of course they didn't have a saw, but any means that he had at his disposal to create what God told him to create, as long as he acknowledged what was the specific parts of that, were left up to him. Okay, how many feet between the decks? Okay, I guess that was left up to Noah, because God doesn't specify how many feet between the decks, but he specifies a window. Could Noah have added multiple windows all the way around? I want to see what's going on. What did God say? One window in one of the sides. Okay, but there were some things that he left up to Noah. And so that's a great example of specific versus general or generic authority. is that within generic authority, we have leeway in terms of how to do that. For instance, for us today, we have kind of a way in which we have services. Usually we have a song, we have a prayer, we have a song, we have the sermon, we have the two songs, the Lord's Supper, contribution, song, closing prayer. Okay, that's kind of our general order of services on Sunday. Does it have to be in that order? Thanks, Dwayne. No, does it have to be in that order? It doesn't have to be. Jesus, God, the apostles never said anything about what specific order, but what is specific, orderly. In 1 Corinthians 14, as Paul writes to the saints, all things be done decent and in order, because God is not the author of confusion, but the author of what? Peace. Okay? And so all things would be done decent and in order. People need to understand what's coming, what's going on, whether we have that posted on the board or we announce it at the beginning, and usually if we ever change anything up, make any change for that Sunday for whatever reason, it'll be announced ahead of time. Okay, for this Sunday, we're doing things a little bit different. Instead of our normal routine, here's how we're going to do this. But the Lord leaves that up to us to decide, do we want to have the Lord's Supper at the very beginning? Do we want to have the Lord's Supper at the end? That's part of the leeway we're given. But is the Lord's Supper to be part of our worship on Sunday? Yes, it is. Is the giving of our means supposed to be a part of our worship on Sunday? Yes, it is. When we're gathered together, should we be singing in praise to God? Yes, we should. Okay, we offer up prayer as the New Testament saints did to the Lord. We teach the gospel. All right, those are all elements of our worship that we are either told directly or give an example of being included in the worship of God. Must we have specific authority for everything we practice? Okay, and that's a good point. This is a tricky question to answer in the sense of what are we referring to as specific authority? If we're going so far as to include expedience in that, then we're kind of left out on a limb, so to speak, because we don't have all of the specific details, such as where the saints met all the time. Sometimes it was in an upper room, as in Troas in Acts 20, because what's-his-face fell out the window. Eutychus, I don't know why I always want to call him Malchus. I don't know why. His ear wasn't cut off. Eutychus fell out the window, okay, and because he fell asleep. We see the apostles meeting in an upper room before the church was established in Acts chapter 1, for instance. But for a lot of these other congregations, we don't know where some of them met. Some met in the houses of saints who had the means to be able to host a congregation in their house. But it wasn't consistent all the way through. It's wherever they had the opportunity and availability to be able to meet. So what I would suggest is that second part of question 3 isn't including the concept of expedience. And again, let me emphasize, an expedient is something that neither adds to or takes away anything from worship, from the commandment of the Lord and how the church is organized or how it's structured or how it worships, anything like that. It's a means that helps us or assists us in fulfilling those commands. So if we eliminate the expedient aspect of it, must we have specific authority for everything we practice? I would suggest yes, at least in terms of in that direct command or approved example or necessary inference, because a lot of what we do on Sunday is in those last two categories, approved example and necessary inference. Not that we don't have direct commands as well, but generally the direct commands tend to be a little bit more generalized. Whereas in the New Testament, we see specific examples, again, of the saints singing. Okay, as Paul commanded both the Ephesians and the Colossians to sing and make melody in your hearts to the Lord. The command to lay by and store. Okay, well, how did they do that? What was the process for that? Different congregations may have done it in different ways, but they all did it together on the first day of the week when they were gathered as a church. We, as a matter of convenience, do it right after the Lord's Supper. Do we have to do it that way? No, we don't. But it's a matter of, again, convenience of fulfilling that command. Anything else through that question? All right. There are a few specifics that I wanted to note that Brother Cogdell discusses a little bit here. Going up to when he starts talking about in this point 4 about how to establish from New Testament Scripture's authority, and he talks about necessary inference. It's interesting because I really like the definition he uses. Obviously, precept or command is that direct statement, or this is what I want you to do. By approved example, this is what we see of the apostles and the New Testament saints doing or being told to do. Necessary inference, that which, though neither expressly stated nor specifically exemplified, yet is necessarily implied by the clear import and meaning of the language used. Kind of a fancy-dancy definition of it, but in the end, what his point is that this is something that is utilized to bring about the fulfillment of the Word of God within the structure that God has given. There are churches that claim having donuts and coffee during class period, for instance, here against this back wall, that would be an expedient to get people in here for Bible class. Would the church hosting donuts and coffee be an expedient? Is part of the church's purpose designed to feed people? Is that what the church is designed to do? No. It's not its purpose to be a social hub, and its purpose is not to feed people. In fact, Paul, granted this is within worship and the taking of the Lord's Supper, but Paul in 1 Corinthians 11, what did he tell them about eating and drinking? You have homes to eat and drink in. Okay? The purpose of coming here is to worship God. And for this time period, to learn more about God's Word. Okay, so by adding coffee and donuts or a fellowship hall or a gymnasium, we're actually adding to the structure that God has given us within the example of the New Testament. We're actually adding elements to the mission of the church. It's not just about seeking and saving the lost with a focus on the soul. Now it's about trying to lure people in, which I personally think is bait and switch. We're going to bring them in with coffee and donuts and then try to convert them. Kind of the old bait and switch thing. And that's not how the church is supposed to function. That's not how we're supposed to work. And certainly not by trying to trick people. And that's not part of what we should be doing. Another point that he makes here, he has several examples, like from Matthew 28, about, for instance, the Great Commission. How can they go? They could walk, they could ride, they'd fly, sail. God didn't specify that. He told them to go. He told them to teach. Well, how should they teach? Is it just sermons from a pulpit that they're supposed to be teaching? No. They could teach one-on-one. They could teach publicly, privately, class setting. It doesn't matter. You teach. Again, you teach the gospel and you teach it within the construct that he's given. We're supposed to assemble, certainly. Hebrews 10:25 is an example of that. And within the example of Hebrews 10, you've got brethren who are forsaking not only the assembly, but they're forsaking the Messiah. They're turning back to the Mosaical law. And certainly as the Hebrew writer brings up, that we're not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some. But certainly in order to worship, we must assemble. What's interesting is since COVID-19 and all that stuff happened, what have we seen more prevalence of the last year and a half or so? People staying home for church. It's far more convenient to stay at home in my pajamas and just watch church on TV. Yeah, to stay at home to be called out. Yeah, and it's important to emphasize the difference between, for instance, we have live stream for our members, for those who are sick, for those who are recovering from whatever, and they can't get to worship. Okay, that's why we have that available. We don't have it going public. It's not a public live stream for anybody to watch. It's specifically for our members, those who can't make it. okay, because they can't make it. It's not to be a substitute for, I really don't feel like going today because I'm too tired, and so I'm going to sit and I'm going to watch church and I'll attend that way. Is that the example of the New Testament? No. No. The example of the New Testament was assembling together, being together, called out together. And yet, unfortunately, some technology has served as an attempt to substitute that. And certainly that's not what we're supposed to do.
The verse before that, Hebrews 10:24, was for both love and good works, and that's done via the simple.
Yeah. How can I stir up love and good works for my brethren if I'm not with them? Yeah. If I'm virtual and you can't see me and I can't see you or I can't hear you or whatever, I can't be stirred up. So it's kind of hard to do that. Singing. He brings up singing. So he brings up assembling. Well, where can you assemble? In a home, in a rented place. We can own a quote unquote meeting house. Technically, this is a church building. This is not the church. This is the church building. It's where we meet, and it's convenient because it's a centralized location. Everybody knows where we're going, and people in our community know that we're here. So it makes that convenient for us. Singing. We can sing with our songbooks, or there's some songs that we could sing by memory, and it wouldn't make any difference whatsoever. And we don't all have to sing the same parts, but what is important within the process of singing? Yeah, the words that we're singing, making sure we understand what's taking place. Okay? Right. So, we can't have half the building singing one hymn and the other half singing a different hymn. Because how are we supposed to encourage and help each other if I'm trying to sing a set of verses from this page and y'all are singing a different page? Okay, talk about confusing. All right? And what's the church, the assembly of the saints not supposed to be? Confusing and chaos. Okay, so yeah, we have soprano, alto, tenor, bass, all of those parts. Those are modern. Those are Western modern aspects of melody. But we all have to make sure we're on the same page, literally. Okay, and this is why a lot of times, especially, we don't really do it as much as we used to. Maybe once every couple of months we need to, but have singing nights where we learn new songs, so that we're not, kind of putting new songs on a Sunday, for instance, and nobody knows how to sing it or what's going on. That would be one of the purposes or benefits of that, is so that when we're in the middle of worship, we're not singing a song nobody knows. But making sure we're all together and all on the same page. And of course, he brings out Noah's Ark as examples of this. He couldn't use walnut, pine, ash, spruce, so forth.
There's a specific and generic both in that. Specific is gopher wood, but a generic would be like white gopher wood, red gopher wood, different types of gopher wood. So in some of these, you have both specific and generic within the
Sure.
same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about gopher wood having different varieties of gopher wood, but certainly there are different varieties of pine and walnut and that sort of thing. So there may very well have been different varieties of gopher wood. Well, what kind specifically do you want me to use, God? Well, use whichever one you want, whatever looks the best. It doesn't matter. Gopher wood. And one of the water of cleansing with the ashes of a red heifer. It couldn't just be a heifer, it had to be a red heifer. That's specific. Okay, we'll stop there. We'll pick up a little bit with a couple more of these points that he brings up because there's one or two more points that are very specific, I think, that are important to bring out. And then we'll move on to lesson 4 next Sunday. Thank you, everybody.